It's January 2026. Russia is now in the fourth year of its war against Ukraine. And today we're going to take a look at the military situation. I'm Julian Rupke and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start in southern Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region. One of the most important battles of the war between Russia and Ukraine is playing out there right now. It's the battle for Stepnohirsk, a small town which is in fact the last real town before Zaporizhzhia, a city of roughly 700,000 in southern Ukraine that Russia annexed and is now trying to capture. We're looking at new footage that shows us the town of Stepnohirsk, or at least the center of Stepnohirsk. What do we see? We see it here from the perspective of a Russian drone, that this center is still under Ukrainian control, and we can see those massive buildings standing here in the center. We can clearly see how heavily they were shelled from all sides. Every window's been blown out. Of course, no civilians live there anymore, and the Russians are trying with their fiber lines to operate, as we can see, inside houses, and the Ukrainian soldiers to defeat those who continue to resist there in Stepnohirsk. We can watch the footage here a bit longer and see that the Ukrainian defense has really become limited to these high-rises in the town center. And even though we don't see any Ukrainian soldiers here and therefore don't have to pixelate anything, we know they're there. We know that the Russians so far still haven't managed to gain any real foothold here. Not yet at all, really. We're about to look at footage that doesn't show the Russians already in the high-rises here, but that the high-rise complex was still being held by the Ukrainians. And it's actually the very last settlement before Zaporizhzhia, the last big, strong settlement. There are still a few villages left, and that's why Ukraine has to hold on to them at all costs. And while we just saw the Russian perspective on those high-rises, we also have new footage from the Ukrainian army that shows the defenders who are holed up inside these buildings. These are real clips. You see it every now and then when someone looks out the window from the same high-rises we just saw, only now from a Ukrainian perspective. We have information from the Ukrainians that bit by bit, you can see it pretty clearly here, that's how we can pinpoint it. The low buildings, the school buildings in the middle, and the large buildings around them, where the people used to live back then before the Russians invaded here. And we know from the Ukrainians that some Russian soldiers managed to get into those high-rise buildings where they set themselves up for a short time and were later driven out again. So it's kind of back and forth. On many maps from Russian war bloggers, they have even portrayed the current situation as though the whole city is supposedly under Russian control. We can see from both Russian footage and Ukrainian footage that that's not the case. At least the center of Stepnohirsk remains under Ukrainian control. And while here we can still see the soldiers basically clearing the buildings of at least presumed Russians who had taken shelter there in the meantime, let's also take a look at this on the map. So we want to understand why Stepnohirsk is currently the most important place of fighting in southern Ukraine. Let's zoom in a bit here into the southern part of the map and pause here for a moment. As we already reported in the past few days, some first Russian soldiers have advanced as far as Primorsk, a small village a bit north of Stepnohirsk. And this village is now just about 17 kilometers away from Zaporizhzhia. So that means the whole thing still affects the big city, 700,000 people, even now in the fourth year of the war. It's dangerous now because the Russians are coming in there with their fiber optic drones with about a 20-kilometer range. Much more important, though, is that the Ukrainians keep holding this place here, Stepnohirsk, because if they stop holding it, we'd end up with a situation. We can zoom in a bit more. That the red area, I mean the solidly Russian-held zone, would spread further north, and there'd pretty much be no resistance left in this region, and the Russians would then, across a broad front, move toward the city of Zaporizhzhia. We just saw it here on the map, pretty small. That's roughly the town area of Stepnohirsk, and those houses we just saw are not in the red area, but actually in this area, almost exactly on this little square here, right in the corner or the middle of Stepnohirsk, and it looks so small. There are just a few abandoned houses that Ukraine still holds, but that's actually the most important thing in the region. We can also see it pretty clearly. As you can see, the highway from the south of Zaporizhzhia up to Zaporizhzhia city goes right through this town. And in that respect, it's an extremely important place that the Ukrainians are really trying to hold on to. We have further attacks here a little. Further to the east, Oryhiv is under attack. We saw a bit further east, Huljapol has already fallen under Russian control. That means the Russians are trying to push forward along the entire front. But that's exactly the main point, because here you'd run straight into the large metropolis of the area, the enchanting city, and Ukraine will prevent that even in the fourth year of the war, and soon will be in the fifth at all costs. From Zaporizhzhia we move on to Donetsk, a bit further east in the country. Here we have new footage that shows just how massive the Russians' logistics in Pokrovsk have become. That means in the once 65,000 inhabitant town, which over the last months, one has to say, was taken by them. Mostly we can take a look at the whole thing, now, both again from the Ukrainian side and then from the Russian side as well. First off, we can see a Ukrainian drone attacking here, but it's not so much about the drone as it's about the very massive convoys moving around here inside Pokrovsk right now. Only 4 vehicles here, but you'll see in the different shots, or maybe 5 vehicles. There really are that many. Absolutely so many Russians in the city now, and so much logistics being brought in to push from Pokrovsk further west to attack. And that's pretty impressive. Yeah, we can see the Russian getting away at the last moment while his quad gets hit. And here, though, some more footage now also from the Ukrainian side. I can step back a bit and you can really see that it's almost like traffic jams of destroyed or damaged vehicles all over the city, spreading out along the streets that lead into the city center or off to the northwest. And the whole thing is actually pretty impressive. We'll also soon see what the whole thing looks like from a Russian perspective. Maybe let's just finish watching the video first. From a Russian perspective, what it looks like, that it isn't just individual soldiers, but here we can see it. But that they're very, very large columns that are attacking, in this case, I think 2 or 3 vehicles, each one packed full of Russian soldiers. And this is the moment we see a Ukrainian attack. You can also see the Russians have set up very large jammers, like signal jammers. Also here, by the way, different jammers for different frequencies, but in this case they don't help much because the Ukrainians are aiming at individual Russian soldiers all around. We really have to pixelate this because you can see it's a direct hit and at least 2 or 3 Russians get hit here and die. But it does show us how logistics around Pokrovsk have swelled, that even despite the bad weather, the adverse conditions, and the extremely heavy losses on the Russian side, more and more Russian vehicles, more and more Russian soldiers are basically moving into Pokrovsk to launch further attacks from there. We're looking at it on the map and can indeed see it's really already become a major logistics route by now, coming up from the south, from the occupied regions a while back, towards Donetsk city and then onto Pokrovsk. So all those routes we just looked at run roughly along here for the most part indeed. These are all the different roads we can see. They all go into Pokrovsk. There they're trying to gather, trying to set up these temporary depots. And as we already showed yesterday, the attacks are still ongoing toward Frysheim and along the N32. That's the highway that goes straight to Dnipropetrovsk into the neighboring region. And of course also toward Rodinsky in the north. There's at least still one there too. Small Ukrainian presence, or rather the town is still being fought over. And that's why we have the Ukrainian attacks, which don't start up here, not just in the last few kilometers, but maybe we can mark that in white. We can see here 4 kilometers is a short distance. Even Ukrainian fiber optic drones can reliably reach about 20 kilometers. So if they're launched from here, yeah, what is that? It reaches roughly up to here. And the radio drones even have ranges of 40, 50 kilometers. So all of the logistics here, Russian logistics, is in serious danger by Ukrainian drones. We will now look at Ukrainian longer-range strikes into Russia. First, an attack carried out using an American HIMARS system on Buk systems, specifically on Buk systems in the Kursk region in western Russia. These Buk systems were sent here and are being attacked further because the Ukrainians, of course, want to keep striking with their drones, specifically toward central Russia, toward Moscow and so on. And for that reason, we have surveillance here on the Ukrainians who are trying to see exactly where the bug systems are firing from and where they then pull back to again later. And here in winter, it's pretty easy to follow it. We can quickly trace it back. As you can see, the tracks in the snow are just super easy to spot. We saw it in recent footage in thermal view even more clearly. They pretty much glow there, but even in daylight we can see fairly well when tracked vehicles move through the snow. And so the Ukrainians had it pretty easy here to basically follow the Russians and now see where those two systems were hiding in the woods. We're 27 kilometers away from the Russian-Ukrainian border, from the actual border, and yet the Ukrainians are managing it here now, as we'll see in a moment, with 2 M142 launchers using those rockets with roughly an 85-kilometer range to strike inside Russia and hit those 2 systems. Let's take a quick look at the map, the same one we just saw a moment ago, to clearly see that Ukraine keeps striking progressively more and more further and further inside Russia. But why is it so important? Because these nighttime drone attacks very often head this way toward Yelabuga, Kazan, Moscow and so on. So the Russians are trying to build up air defenses inside their country, and the Ukrainians are trying from outside their country, as part of their defense efforts, to knock those air defenses out. But even inside the country, the Ukrainian army is still actively attempting to take out Russian medium-range systems. shows a serious mistake by the Russian army. Here you can see from a drone's bomber perspective that two BM-21 Grad systems were placed right next to each other. That means they're not firing here. They're actually parked only about 10 or 15 meters apart, and of course in this case an obvious and vulnerable sitting duck for the Ukrainian army. You can still see it pretty clearly. The lighter ones up front are basically. The engines may be still warm. And also the driver cabs, the darker ones behind, that's where the rockets are. There's naturally less heat, so they're harder to see on the thermal here. And now we can already see the first shells being dropped. So this perspective here isn't just a recon drone, it's a bomber drone that in this moment here, I hope you can make this out, those are the shells which are being dropped onto the Grad launchers, which are even loaded with Grad rockets, as we'll see in just a moment, namely by this relatively strong explosion. The very first shell didn't do anything, the second one did quite a lot. You can also clearly see here the two launchers parked right next to each other. Now we're about to see the first explosion. There it is, a massive blast. The first Grad launcher was destroyed. These Grad launchers can be loaded with up to 40 rockets, and you really do find yourself wondering a bit that they were apparently just casually set out right there like that. Here both were also loaded for the next day, for the next mission, set out like that, and then just left standing, pretty much just waiting for the Ukrainians to attack. And again, here we see the first shell hit. There's a small explosion first. That was basically the most damage we could see from this. However, if I were to see now that the Ukrainians apparently had no grenades left, and now the second vehicle, we can see the mortar here, it's getting easier to make out the outlines back there with the rocket launcher, that it's now being attacked by a kamikaze drone and will react accordingly right away. And that's kind of weird, really. Of course, now the need to deal with the drone protection. You can see it here pretty clearly. On the rockets, we've got these protective devices that were also set up out front. People everywhere are trying to defend themselves against these drones, and then you just leave the launchers exposed like that. It's surprising to see such important pieces left so openly unprotected, standing there without any real shielding or concealment, practically inviting detection and attack or any assault whatsoever. But Russia is mass producing these and will likely replace them soon in coming weeks and months. But the Ukrainian army is still losing valuable equipment. We've obtained a new Russian video that shows a fiber optic drone has managed to detect a Bodana S right here in this spot. This is a 155mm artillery piece of the Ukrainian army that was just found here. And we can take a look at the whole thing. We're already in the area. We're still pretty close to the war zone here. We've got these dragon's teeth here, these anti-tank barriers that have been set up. Right next to them, we've got the trench systems as well, indeed. Different ways to try to stop the Russians here. And just right behind it, this gun has been set up. Of course, the Ukrainians keep moving them further back into the country to prepare for the Russian advances. But we're probably only like 15, 20, 25 kilometers away from the front. Ukraine tried here to really get this Bodana S produced domestically as well, locally. Yeah, at least to move it and to set it up. But the Russian drones spotted the whole thing, and we can see it's fiber optic, so they were watching the whole thing from above. Then realized you can't get to it through all those branches, so they went straight down the driveway, the same one the gun had taken. And as we pull in closer, you can clearly see that it's a self-propelled gun indeed. There's also the Bodana B as a towed gun, and on the cab up front you can see that's a Kraz made in Ukraine, not a Tatra from the Czech Republic. So that means, as we've just seen in this particular case right here, we can see a direct hit. The only thing you always have to say is when the Russians only show the hit from the point of view of the drone or attacking drone and not from the viewpoint of a reconnaissance drone, then there's a pretty good chance the attack failed, that there were no explosions at all. And so after you've spotted the enemy vehicle and basically watched the whole thing, you don't release the footage so as not to show, okay, that attack backfired. We just saw that with the Ukrainians. They also keep trying from a second bird's eye view to prove the attacks really did in fact work. If those recordings aren't available, you should be extremely skeptical about that, frankly. There's at least a real chance that the whole thing was filmed, that it flopped, and that's why it isn't actually being put online. We'll move on to an aspect of this war that's rarely covered. The vehicles that keep getting attacked and are sometimes quite badly damaged in the process indeed. They're not automatically lost. Both sides still try to actively recover them from the battlefield. Same here, we're looking at a video from the Ukrainian side where you can very clearly and plainly see a Leopard 1 A5 tank, an old German tank that was delivered. To the first, tank battalion of the 5th Separate Brigade. It was being hit here by Russian drones right now. It's heavily damaged but doesn't explode. You can see it here. The Russians keep coming at it. The tank more or less survives, but it's no longer mobile. What do the Ukrainians do? They don't just leave them there. They want every single vehicle back because they have so few tanks and they really need them. And now we can see here a recovery team from the 1st Battalion of the 5th Brigade out at night trying to get this tank back out as fast as they can. That means even though we're basically in the kill zone, and even though we just saw at least 3 drones reach the tank, the soldiers here are risking their lives to fairly quickly at night. Chain up the damaged vehicle and tow it out of the danger area. Yeah, and we'll see in a moment which vehicles are being used. What we're looking at here is also a vehicle delivered from Germany, a Berger Panzer II on a Leopard 1 chassis, which is used to tow the other Leopard 1 off here. And the Ukrainians then actually managed to pull it off. Now we can see the footage the next day. The sun's up and they've just now managed it. We can see it pretty clearly here. This up front is the recovery vehicle, the one the Ukrainians reinforced with ERA-1 reactive armor. On top, it's also got those anti-drone nets, or rather anti-drone mounts, and that the Leopard 1 was towed away. Yeah, the Ukrainians celebrate that accordingly. Sure, that's a relatively old tank. It probably only cost about 1.5 million euros when it was sold, or at least when it was handed over to Ukraine. That's how much it cost. Still, for the Ukrainians, as you can see, every tank matters. And that's why people risk their lives to recover even damaged vehicles. The next video clearly demonstrates how modern Russian methods of warfare have now been widely deployed all across the battlefield. We see that once again in a drone video from the Ukrainians. What we're seeing here is in the south of the country, in the Zaporizhia region, an old chimney or something very much like it was used to conceal something inside, namely an Article S system. An absolutely modern, cutting-edge, high-tech system that monitors a whole range of frequencies of Ukrainian communications, so it's able to pick up Ukrainians communicating among themselves during attacks and so on, to eavesdrop on logistics planning and then pass that information on. The Ukrainians are extremely proud of it. Several accounts had this here, that they actually managed not just to find it, but to attack it here as well. Because, of course, there are numerous defense options, electronic warfare, for instance, that actively jam or keep these drones away to protect the system. Nonetheless, in this case, we can actually see the strike on this Article S system. And we can see the Russians tried to hide it. They set it up there. They probably got in down there, then set that chimney up on top. And Ukraine is pretty happy to have destroyed that, because that's really modern electronic warfare that Russia uses to eavesdrop on the Ukrainians and to basically predict their tactical moves in the days and weeks immediately ahead of them as a whole. Finally, we come to long-range strikes, in this case those by the Ukrainian army, which shouldn't obscure the fact that Russia continues to destroy power plants and other critical infrastructure in Ukraine every day. Here we can see a first attack on Debaltsev, a town that fell to the Russian army in March of 2015. You can really see these massive explosions right here. The Ukrainian army completely blew up a Russian explosives and ammunition depot right here. So first we're seeing eyewitness footage from the night before last, and those are all artillery shells that were found around Debaltsev. So that means it's all ammunition, essentially. We just saw it. It flew in all directions, landed across several kilometers, and caused quite a bit of damage there. We haven't heard of any fatalities so far. Still, this is another strike on Russian ammunition depots in eastern Ukraine. And in the Krasnodar region, the Ukrainian army also tried to strike over the past few days. However, it's unclear if anything there was hit by Ukraine. What is clear, though, is that the Russians made an extremely serious mistake during the interception attempt here. They fired an S-300 missile from an S-300 system, a relatively modern air defense system. You can see it here. It went up over the town of Afipski, as I said, in the Krasnodar region. But now we're seeing the whole thing filmed by many eyewitnesses. The rocket didn't just go up, it crashed back down shortly afterward right into the town, causing massive destruction. We have footage from many eyewitnesses here showing how the Russian rocket, after its launch, did not in fact hit a Ukrainian drone or a cruise missile at all, but instead it crashes down and strikes the city right here. And we can, or indeed must, now watch the footage from eyewitnesses who actually recorded it. What we can see here is that there's really been a lot of destruction. Parking lots were hit, parked cars were hit, that houses were also damaged, and all of this is of course pretty bitter for the people there because Ukraine conducts its strikes very, very precisely and essentially does not in fact target civilian infrastructure at all. However, because of this attempt by the Russian army to defend, which went off target, it ultimately led to a friendly fire hit. The Russians haven't commented on whether there were dead or injured here, probably because they knew they themselves were responsible for this particular strike, and in that sense it's still a war that directly hits and affects civilians on both sides equally. On the one hand, it deliberately targets the civilian population inside Ukraine because there Russia is doing everything to make sure people have no power, no heat, no light, and on the other hand, Ukrainian attacks on military structures can also, if it comes to that, as we've just seen, ultimately end up harming innocent civilians in the process.